So for March 22nd, the fourth Sunday in Lent, as you follow along at home, the readings today include 1 Samuel chapter 16, verses 1 through 13. The psalm is Psalm 23. The second reading is from Ephesians chapter 5, verses 8 through 14. And the gospel comes from John chapter 9, verses 1 through 41. It's the story of the man born blind who receives back his sight as a result of a miracle performed by Jesus. So, as we get into the idea of blindness, there's a lot of things going on in the gospel lesson, and the irony in the lesson is that those within the church structure of that day in the end are exposed and revealed to be blind, while the one who was literally blind actually sees what God is doing in the world more clearly than the traditional church folk of the time. I don't know if this is true or not, but we'll talk about John Newton in a moment. But I have it in mind that if you read John chapter 9, 1 through 41, maybe you'll catch a glimpse of what the first verse of this famous hymn is actually driving at. You'll recognize it right away. Blind, but now I see. So there's a few different stories around about John Newton, the man who penned the text to that well-known hymn. Part of his background, and this seems to be pretty well agreed upon, part of his background was that of a slave trader. But somewhere along in his journey in life, he begins to realize, and ultimately realize, that to enslave another human being, to view another human being as property, and to ultimately just simply devalue another human being, in this case, an African American human being, but in any context, to devalue any human being is a problem. And it's ultimately, even though there's lots of arguments that people have made over the history of the church, it's ultimately a losing argument to think that it's legitimate to enslave another human being. And so when he has his great epiphany and actually leaves the slave trade and begins to become an abolitionist, advocating and ultimately fighting for the freedom of slaves and by extension the freedom of all human beings out of that experience, he pens this beautiful hymn that is arguably the best known hymn of all hymns that we ever sing in the church. Amazing grace, how sweet the sound. I was lost, but now I'm found. I was blind, but now I see. So those themes are percolating within this text from John's Gospel as we began to discuss last week in John chapter 4, talking about what real worship looks like and what it means to worship in spirit and in truth. Today takes us to the actualization of what it really means to worship. Last week we left the gospel with this understanding that real worship isn't about ritual. Real worship, when we love one another, we are, in fact, worshiping God in the truest and best sense of the word, in the best sense of the idea. So today it takes on a little bit of a new idea. In the old way of thinking, and maybe some of that lingers today in our lives. If someone is plagued with an ailment or an unfavorable or unfortunate condition, in the old way of thinking, and it comes out in the gospel reading, who sinned? This person who's blind, or his parents? Somebody did something wrong. This person brought this condition on themselves. It's their fault. That's the long and the short of it. In the end, we learn that isn't really true. And not only that, but as I said before, this dynamic of the ones who think they see, the church folk of that day, really don't see. And it's the one that didn't see that really has their eyes open, not only physically and literally, but in a spiritual and emotional sense, that they begin to see that something bigger than themselves is going on. And that's, I hope, part of the story behind John Newton and why he pens this wonderful hymn in his own recognition that he was a part of an unjust practice, enslaving another human being. But then the question for us becomes, on the upside, we're reminded that through the hymn and even through the text, that our eyes have really been opened to the human experience, to our relationship with one another, and ultimately our relationship with God. That's the gospel, that Jesus, that God himself has opened our eyes to a new reality, that really all human beings were created equal, that all human beings have value. The challenge is actually treating one another like we all have value, finding value, recognizing value, and not only recognizing the value, but then taking what we recognize and beginning to treat the other in the way that we were ultimately created to be treated. And this comes back to John 4, last week's gospel, and this idea of worshiping in spirit and in truth. When we love one another, when we value one another, it's not about all the ritual that takes place on a Sunday or in some other traditional context that we have otherwise defined as worship. It's when we really love one another that we are worshiping God, that we are doing what we were created to do. That's the story of the hymn. That's the story of our lives. And so the question we're left with today, during an ongoing time, an ongoing season in our lives of, on the one hand, physical separation, social distancing, quarantine, asking, well, how can I love you where you are, how you are? How can I recognize value in you? Because my eyes have been opened. I was blind to that reality, but now I see that I was created to value you. Regardless of your religious tradition or religious expression, or whether I like you or not, I was created to value you. How will I value you today? And so the challenge then moving forward during a confusing period in our lives individually, as this virus continues to unfold and we wrestle with it, trying to understand where it comes from, how it's spread, how we can protect not only ourselves but those around us that we should value. And that's part of the reason why we're social distancing. It's part of the reason why we're trying to stay at home more than we go out, so that that curve can be lowered, and others can be kept safe, protected. That's one of the ways that we actually begin to do worship, in actually following some of the rules that are being prescribed by the government and so forth. That's one act of worship. That's true. That in doing that, you're worshiping God in a meaningful way, and that's a beautiful thing. But not only that, then the question then becomes, how will I connect to you during this experience of social distancing? And we've talked about the phone calls, which is good. And hopefully you've been thinking about who you can call. Just a phone call. Doesn't have to be long, but an opportunity to connect with someone else. Because the longer we sit alone, social isolation sets in, and we begin, out of that isolation, to feel disconnected. Well, this gospel lesson and the hymn reminds us that we were created for connection. Even when you go back to the Genesis story, and God creates humanity, man and woman, part of the reason that a partner is created is that God recognizes it's not good for the man to be alone. We weren't created to be alone. Now, it's a challenging time to address this idea of isolation or aloneness, but there are always creative ways that we can do that. And as you sit wherever you are and you contemplate these ideas, you are invited again to be creative in how you can reconnect with those whom you already love and feel like you have strong relationships with, but then also begin to think about people that maybe you're disconnected from. And maybe now becomes the opportunity to reconnect. And in every instance where we connect with one another, we rediscover that we are connected with our God, and we discover in a new and meaningful way that we are actually worshiping God in our connectedness. Amen.